Sometimes the smallest joke opens the biggest door your heart has been afraid to knock on. No one in the executive lounge expected silence to be the loudest answer that rainy Thursday evening. Ethan Brooks had spent 12 straight hours balancing client reports, answering emails, and wondering whether he would make it to his daughter Lily's school on time the next morning after another late shift. At 38 years old, he had learned that exhaustion was simply another part of being a single father. He loosened his tie, smiled at the coworkers gathered around the conference table, and tried to lighten the mood after another impossible deadline. Charlotte Bennett, the respected owner of Bennett Financial Group, stood at the opposite end of the room reviewing a stack of financial documents with the same calm confidence that had made her one of the youngest executives in Chicago. Everyone knew she demanded excellence. Everyone knew she rarely smiled inside the office. Ethan chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck before saying the one sentence he never imagined would change his life. "If nobody else wants to marry me, maybe you should, boss." Laughter immediately filled the room. Someone nearly spilled a cup of coffee. Another employee shook his head, convinced Ethan had finally crossed a professional line. Yet Charlotte never laughed. She slowly lifted her eyes from the folder in her hands and looked directly at Ethan. Her expression did not reveal anger. It did not reveal embarrassment either. Instead, there was something almost impossible to describe, as though she had just heard words she had been waiting years to hear, even though they had been spoken as nothing more than a joke. She quietly closed the folder and placed it on the polished walnut table. "Come with me," she said. The laughter disappeared instantly. Ethan blinked. "Ma'am?" he asked, convinced he had misunderstood. Charlotte repeated herself in the same calm voice. "Come with me." Without another explanation, she turned toward the private elevator beside her office. The soft sound of her heels echoed across the marble floor, while every employee watched in complete disbelief. Ethan remained, frozen for a heartbeat before following her, unsure whether he was about to lose his job or hear words that would change everything he believed about the woman who had quietly employed him for the past 3 years. The elevator doors closed behind them, shutting out the whispers growing louder downstairs. Neither of them spoke as the elevator climbed toward the executive residence above the offices. Rain traced gentle lines across the glass walls overlooking the glowing Chicago skyline. Ethan stared at the changing floor numbers, his heart beating faster with every passing second. He had apologized 100 times in his mind before the elevator even stopped. When the doors finally opened, Charlotte stepped into a warmly lit hallway that looked nothing like the sleek corporate world below. Family photographs lined the walls. Fresh flowers rested on a narrow wooden table. The comforting scent of chamomile tea drifted through the quiet home. She walked to the final door at the end of the hallway, rested one hand on the brass handle, and paused for a long moment before opening it. Then she turned back toward Ethan, her blue eyes carrying the weight of a memory far older than the conversation they had just shared. "Everything you think this evening is about," she whispered gently, "is not the truth." Ethan remained motionless just inside the doorway, uncertain whether he should apologize again or quietly leave before making the evening any more uncomfortable. The room before him looked nothing like the luxurious space he had imagined. Instead of expensive artwork, framed family photographs rested on warm wooden shelves. Instead of cold modern furniture, there was a comfortable sofa draped with a knitted blanket beside a softly glowing fireplace. A gentle scent of chamomile tea lingered in the air, blending with the faint aroma of cedarwood polished over many years. It felt less like the private residence of one of Chicago's most successful executives and more like a place where someone had carefully protected memories that refused to fade. Charlotte walked slowly toward an antique cabinet beside the window without looking back. She opened the top drawer and carefully removed an old leather photo album, its edges softened by time and frequent use. Holding it with quiet respect, she carried it to the coffee table and rested it between them. Ethan watched every movement, still unable to understand why a simple joke had brought him here. "Charlotte," he said gently, "if I embarrassed you downstairs, I truly am sorry." She looked at him with calm eyes and softly shook her head. "You did not embarrass me." Her answer surprised him. "Then why am I here?" Charlotte placed one hand on the worn leather cover before answering. "Because tonight you unknowingly asked a question that has been waiting for an answer far longer than either of us realized." Ethan frowned, Confused, Charlotte slowly opened the album. The first photograph immediately drew his attention. It showed a community charity event outside a neighborhood church nearly 10 years earlier. Folding tables stood beneath white tents while volunteers served meals to families gathered in the afternoon sunshine. Children laughed across the parking lot. Ethan recognized himself instantly, standing beside his late wife Emily with a paper plate in one hand and a bright smile he had not seen on his own face in years. His heart tightened. He remembered that Saturday well. Emily had insisted they spend their wedding anniversary serving others instead of celebrating themselves. Charlotte quietly turned the page, revealing another photograph from the same afternoon. Ethan leaned closer. This time he noticed someone he had never remembered before. A young blonde woman stood several feet away wearing a simple gray sweater, holding a disposable cup with both hands, watching Emily with uncertain eyes. She looked frightened, exhausted, and completely alone. Ethan glanced back at Charlotte. "That is you," he whispered. Charlotte nodded once. "Yes." Silence settled gently around them. Rain continued sliding down the windows overlooking the city while the old grandfather clock in the hallway quietly marked another passing minute. "I do not remember seeing you," Ethan admitted honestly. Charlotte smiled with remarkable kindness instead of disappointment. "You were never supposed to remember me," she replied. "You and Emily were too busy making certain everyone else felt welcome." She reached beneath the photograph and carefully unfolded a small piece of yellowed stationery tucked safely inside the album. "But I have remembered both of you every single day since then." Ethan accepted the folded paper with careful hands. Before he even opened it, he recognized Emily's unmistakable handwriting across the front. His pulse quickened as memories he thought time had buried began quietly returning, and he realized that whatever truth Charlotte had carried for all these years was only beginning to reveal itself. The paper trembled slightly in Ethan's hands, although the room itself remained perfectly still. He unfolded the note with the same careful touch he once reserved for every birthday card Emily had ever written. The familiar handwriting immediately caught his breath. It was unmistakably hers, graceful, steady, and filled with quiet warmth. The message was short. "Keep believing. The hardest chapter is never the final chapter. One day you will discover that kindness always finds its way home." Beneath the words, Emily had drawn a tiny sunflower, something she often added to letters because she believed sunflowers spent their entire lives searching for light instead of darkness. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. He had not seen that little drawing in years. Charlotte watched him in silence, giving him the dignity of remembering without interruption. Finally she spoke. "She gave me that note before I left the church that afternoon." Ethan slowly looked up. "She carried notes everywhere," he whispered with a faint smile. "She believed encouragement should never be expensive." Charlotte nodded. "I did not understand that at the time. I thought she was simply being kind to a stranger. It took me years to realize she was showing me the kind of person I could become." She carefully lifted another photograph from the album. It showed the same charity event from a different angle. Emily was laughing with several children while Ethan helped an elderly volunteer carry heavy boxes toward a nearby truck. Neither of them seemed aware anyone was watching. "Do you know what I remember most?" Charlotte asked softly. Ethan shook his head. "Not the food. Not the event. Not even the note." Her blue eyes rested on the old photograph. "I remember your wife thanking every volunteer before she thanked herself. I remember you staying after everyone else had gone home because one family still needed help loading groceries into their car. Neither of you knew who I was. Neither of you expected anything in return." Ethan stared quietly at the picture. To him those moments had always seemed ordinary. Emily never treated kindness like something extraordinary. She simply believed it belonged in everyday life. Charlotte folded her hands gently. "After that day I promised myself something." Ethan listened without speaking. "If I ever found stability again, I would build a life that honored what both of you showed me." She smiled with quiet humility. "That promise became my first business plan." Ethan looked around the room once more. The shelves filled with books instead of awards. The family photographs instead of trophies. The warm lighting instead of cold luxury. Suddenly everything made sense. Success had never become Charlotte's identity. Gratitude had. She stood and walked toward a small writing desk beside the window. Opening one drawer, she removed a thin employee file and placed it beside the photo album. Ethan recognized his own name printed neatly across the front. Confusion returned to his face. "That is my personnel file," he said quietly. Charlotte nodded. "It almost never became yours." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" She looked directly into his eyes with complete honesty. 3 years ago, Human Resources recommended hiring someone else. They believed your years away from full-time work after Emily passed made you too much of a risk. Ethan lowered his gaze. He remembered those difficult years well. Every decision had centered on raising Lily, even when it meant sacrificing career opportunities. Charlotte gently rested her hand on the folder. "Then I saw your name, and I asked to read every page myself. What I discovered had nothing to do with your resume. It reminded me of two people who once changed the direction of my entire life without ever asking whether I could repay them." Charlotte slowly opened Ethan's employee file, but instead of reading from it immediately, she rested her fingertips across the cover as though the folder represented something far more important than employment records. "Do you know what I saw that day?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked at her with honest confusion. "A man who had taken years away from his career," he answered. "That is what everyone else saw." Charlotte gently smiled. "That is exactly what everyone else saw." She opened the folder and revealed several interview notes, performance reviews, and handwritten comments from department managers. Ethan recognized none of them. One note read, "Always the first to help new employees without being asked." Another simply said, "Leaves on time every day to pick up his daughter but never misses a deadline." Charlotte looked up from the papers. They thought those comments were ordinary. I did not. Ethan remained silent. She continued in the same calm voice. "Every manager described someone dependable, respectful, and honest. Not because anyone was watching, but because that is simply who you are." Ethan lowered his eyes. "I was only trying to take care of Lily." "Exactly," Charlotte replied. "You never tried to impress the company. You simply kept your promises to your daughter." The words settled deeply inside him. For years he had quietly believed that his career had become smaller because he refused to place work ahead of family. Hearing someone describe those same choices as strength instead of sacrifice felt almost unfamiliar. Charlotte carefully removed another document from the folder. It was the original recommendation from Human Resources suggesting another applicant for the position. Ethan noticed the date and remembered how desperately he had needed that job after months of searching. "You really had another candidate?" he asked. Charlotte nodded. "He had more experience, a stronger resume, and fewer interruptions." Ethan smiled faintly. "That sounds about right." "It did," Charlotte admitted. "Until I asked myself one question." Ethan waited quietly. Charlotte folded the recommendation and placed it back inside the folder. Which person would Emily have hired? Ethan looked at her without speaking. She continued, her voice filled with quiet certainty. The answer became obvious. She would have chosen character before convenience. She would have chosen someone who understood responsibility before ambition. She would have chosen the father who had already proven that love could survive difficult seasons. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Emily had been gone for years, yet somehow her values were still opening doors neither of them had imagined. Charlotte walked toward the bookshelf and gently picked up a small framed photograph of the company during its first year in business. Fewer than 20 employees stood outside a modest office building, smiling proudly. "When I started this company," she said, "I promised myself that success would never cost people their families. I could not always keep that promise perfectly, but I never stopped trying." Ethan suddenly remembered every school concert he had attended because his schedule had quietly been adjusted, every unexpected afternoon off when Lily became sick, and every conversation in which Charlotte had simply nodded without asking him to explain why his daughter came first. None of those moments had been accidents. They had been deliberate choices made by someone honoring a promise that began with one afternoon outside a small church many years earlier. Charlotte turned back toward him, her expression gentle but unmistakably sincere. "There is one more truth you deserve to know," she said softly. "I did not bring you here tonight because of a joke. I brought you here because I can no longer pretend that gratitude is the only reason I have been quietly watching your life all these years." Charlotte remained beside the bookshelf for a long moment, allowing her final sentence to settle naturally into the quiet room. Ethan searched her face, trying to understand what she meant. He had always believed the respect she showed him came from being a fair employer. The possibility that something deeper had quietly existed beneath years of ordinary conversations had never crossed his mind. "I do not understand," he admitted softly. Charlotte walked toward an antique writing desk near the window and unlocked its lowest drawer with a small brass key she carried on her key ring. Inside rested a single cream-colored envelope, carefully preserved despite the passing years. She held it gently before placing it into Ethan's hands. Across the front, written in neat blue ink, were only 6 simple words. "To the family who changed mine forever." Ethan looked up, confused. "I wrote this 10 years ago," Charlotte said. "The night I signed the papers for my first small business." He carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The paper had aged slightly, but the handwriting remained steady. The first sentence immediately drew his attention. "If I ever build a life worth being grateful for, I will spend the rest of it honoring the people who taught me that kindness is stronger than fear." Ethan continued reading while Charlotte quietly waited. The letter described a frightened young woman who believed her future had ended until strangers welcomed her without asking who she was, where she came from, or what she could offer in return. It spoke about a husband who quietly carried heavy boxes for elderly volunteers while smiling as though serving others was simply part of an ordinary Saturday. It described a wife who treated every stranger with the same warmth she offered lifelong friends. Near the bottom of the page, one sentence stood apart from the others. "If I ever find them again, I will never allow their kindness to disappear into memory alone." Ethan slowly lowered the letter. His eyes had become moist, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that one afternoon he and Emily barely remembered had become the foundation of someone else's entire future. "You carried this all these years?" he asked quietly. Charlotte nodded. "Every time I faced a difficult decision, I read it again." She smiled with quiet humility. "Whenever success tempted me to forget where I came from, I remembered 2 ordinary people who never cared whether anyone noticed the good they were doing." Ethan looked around the warm room once more. Suddenly, every detail carried new meaning. The company culture, the respect employees shared, the flexibility given to parents, the scholarships the business quietly funded every year. None of those choices had been accidental. They had grown from a promise written to 2 people who never knew they had inspired it. Charlotte took a slow breath before speaking again. "There is something else I have never told you." Ethan folded the letter carefully and returned it to her. "What is it?" She accepted the envelope but did not put it away. Instead, she held it against her heart. "The first time I saw your employment application, I recognized your last name immediately. I could have introduced myself then. I could have told you everything on your first day." She paused, her blue eyes filled with quiet sincerity. "But I realized gratitude should never become a burden for the person receiving it. So I chose to wait until the truth could become a gift instead." Ethan stood speechless, realizing that for 3 years every act of kindness Charlotte had quietly extended toward him had never been motivated by obligation. It had been the patient expression of a grateful heart that, somewhere along the way, had begun to care about far more than a promise made long ago. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt earned, as though every unanswered question from the past had finally found a place to rest. Ethan looked down at the old envelope before carefully placing it back on the writing desk. He took a slow breath, searching for words that suddenly seemed much smaller than everything Charlotte had shared. "I spent years believing I had simply been lucky," he said quietly. "Lucky to find a company that understood I had a daughter waiting for me every afternoon. Lucky to have a boss who never questioned why I left exactly at 5:30. Lucky that every time life became difficult, someone quietly made room for me without asking for an explanation." Charlotte gently shook her head. "That was never luck." She walked toward the large window overlooking the Chicago skyline where the rain had finally begun to fade, leaving the city lights shimmering across the wet streets below. "It was a promise," she said softly. "A promise I made to myself after meeting you and Emily. I wanted to build a place where people never had to choose between success and the people they loved." Ethan joined her near the window, keeping a respectful distance. "You succeeded," he replied. Charlotte smiled faintly. "Not because of me. Because every time I wondered what the right decision might be, I asked myself how Emily would have treated that person." Ethan lowered his eyes, feeling both gratitude and humility. She would never believe she deserved any credit for this. I know, Charlotte answered. That is exactly why she deserves it. The old grandfather clock quietly marked another passing hour while warm light filled the room. Ethan found himself remembering the countless evenings he had rushed from work to pick up Lily from school, the science fairs he never missed, the bedtime stories read after exhausting days, and every moment he had quietly worried he was falling behind everyone else professionally. For the first time, he realized those choices had never made him weaker. They had revealed the kind of man he truly was. Charlotte turned toward him, her expression calm but unmistakably sincere. There is one question I have wanted to ask for a very long time. Ethan met her eyes. What is it? She folded her hands gently before speaking. May I meet Lily? Ethan blinked in surprise. Charlotte continued before he could answer. Not as your employer. Not because I feel responsible for anything that happened years ago. I would simply like the opportunity to know the little girl whose father quietly reminds me every day that kindness survives even after loss. Ethan smiled for the first time since stepping into the room, and the weight he had carried throughout the evening seemed noticeably lighter. She would probably ask you 100 questions, he said with a quiet laugh. Charlotte laughed softly as well, the sound warm and genuine. I hope she does. Ethan looked out across the city once more before nodding. She loves libraries, pancakes on Saturday mornings, and planting flowers in the backyard because her mother always believed gardens gave people hope. Charlotte's eyes brightened with quiet emotion. Sunflowers? She asked. Ethan smiled. Always sunflowers. Charlotte closed her eyes for the briefest moment before opening them again with unmistakable gratitude. Then perhaps, she whispered, the next chapter of all our lives should begin there. As Ethan looked back at the woman he had once known only as his reserved employer, he realized that the unexpected journey begun by a careless joke had quietly become something far greater than either of them could have imagined. It had become the first honest step toward healing two hearts, while honoring the one that had taught them both how to love with quiet dignity. 3 evenings later, Ethan parked his aging silver sedan outside the neighborhood public library, just as the autumn sun began settling behind rows of maple trees. Thursday had always been Lily's favorite day because the children's reading circle filled the old brick building with stories, laughter, and homemade cookies prepared by local volunteers. As he helped his daughter out of the car, she adjusted her small backpack decorated with bright yellow sunflowers and smiled up at him. Are you sure your friend is coming? She asked. Ethan smiled gently. I think so. Before he could say anything else, another car quietly pulled into the parking space beside them. Charlotte stepped out wearing a simple navy sweater, blue jeans, and comfortable walking shoes instead of the elegant business suits everyone knew from the office. Her blonde hair moved softly in the evening breeze, and for the first time Ethan realized how different she looked when she was not carrying the responsibilities of an entire company on her shoulders. Lily looked curiously toward her father before whispering, She does not look like a boss. Ethan laughed quietly. No, he answered. Tonight, she is just Charlotte. Charlotte approached slowly, making certain she did not overwhelm the little girl. She carried a canvas tote bag instead of a leather briefcase, and from inside, she carefully removed a beautifully illustrated children's book with a sunflower blooming across the cover. Kneeling until she was at Lily's eye level, she smiled warmly. Hello, Lily. I have heard wonderful things about you. Lily smiled back with the effortless openness only children possess. Daddy says you like books. Charlotte nodded. Very much. She offered the book with both hands. I thought perhaps we could read this one together someday, if you would like. Lily accepted it politely. Thank you. She studied the cover for a moment before her bright blue eyes widened. Sunflowers were my mommy's favorite. Charlotte's expression softened immediately. They have always been my favorite too, she replied quietly. Ethan watched the exchange without speaking. There was nothing forced about the moment. No awkward introductions. No uncomfortable explanations. Only two people connected by someone whose kindness still quietly shaped their lives. Inside the library, children gathered on colorful rugs while volunteers arranged rows of picture books along low wooden shelves. Charlotte listened attentively as Lily eagerly described her favorite stories, her school science project, and the tiny garden she and her father cared for behind their modest home. Every answer Lily gave was met with genuine interest rather than polite conversation. After the reading circle ended, The three of them walked slowly toward a nearby park where leaves drifted gently across the sidewalks. Lily skipped several steps ahead before suddenly turning around. "Can I ask you something?" Charlotte smiled. "Of course." Lily hesitated only briefly. "Daddy smiles more today than he did last week. Did you do that?" Ethan looked down, slightly embarrassed, but Charlotte simply answered with quiet honesty. "I do not think I did." She glanced toward Ethan before looking back at the little girl. "I think your father remembered something beautiful that he thought he had lost." Lily nodded thoughtfully as though the answer made perfect sense. Then, without hesitation, she reached out and took Charlotte's hand while holding Ethan's with the other. Together, they continued walking beneath the golden autumn trees, and for the first time in many years, Ethan no longer felt as though he was carrying the weight of tomorrow by himself. He quietly realized that healing rarely arrived all at once. Sometimes it simply began with one gentle conversation, one shared story, and one child willing to trust kindness before the adults around her found the courage to do the same. Over the following weeks, Thursday afternoons quietly became the favorite part of all three of their lives. Sometimes they met at the neighborhood library before walking to a nearby cafe where Lily always ordered tomato soup and grilled cheese. Other evenings they wandered through the Chicago Botanical Garden, stopping whenever Lily discovered another flower she insisted her mother would have loved. Charlotte never tried to fill a place that belonged to Emily. Instead, she listened. She asked Lily about her favorite bedtime stories, the songs her mother used to sing, and the little traditions that made ordinary days feel special. Every answer mattered to her. Ethan noticed that Charlotte never spoke simply to keep a conversation going. She listened with the same quiet patience Emily once had, making every person around her feel important without drawing attention to herself. One bright Saturday morning, Charlotte accepted an invitation to visit their modest home for the first time. The small white house sat at the end of a peaceful street lined with maple trees just beginning to change color. The wooden porch showed its age, the mailbox leaned slightly to one side, and the old silver sedan rested faithfully in the driveway. It was not an impressive home by any ordinary standard, but it carried something Charlotte recognized immediately. It felt loved. Lily hurried into the backyard carrying packets of sunflower seeds while Ethan followed with a watering can and a small gardening shovel. "Mommy always planted new flowers every fall," Lily explained happily. "Daddy and I kept doing it because it makes the yard feel like she is still cheering for us." Charlotte knelt beside them without hesitation, pressing tiny seeds gently into the dark soil. Warm afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees while a cool breeze carried the scent of fresh grass across the yard. No one hurried. No one checked a phone. The afternoon moved at the comfortable pace of people who had finally stopped measuring life by deadlines. After they finished planting, Lily disappeared into the house and returned holding a small wooden memory box painted with bright yellow sunflowers. She carefully placed it between them on the porch steps. "Daddy and I open this whenever we miss Mommy," she said softly. Ethan looked uncertain for a moment, but Lily smiled reassuringly. "It is okay. Mommy always liked sharing." Charlotte slowly lifted the lid. Inside rested old family photographs, handwritten recipes, birthday cards, pressed flowers, and dozens of little notes Emily had written over the years. One small card caught her attention immediately. In Emily's familiar handwriting it read, "Always leave room at your table because someone, somewhere, is hoping to find a family." Charlotte gently traced the words with one fingertip before quietly wiping away a tear. "She truly believed this," she whispered. Ethan nodded with a peaceful smile. She never separated kindness from everyday life. To her, they were the same thing. Lily looked from one adult to the other before asking the question that had quietly grown inside her heart for days. "Can I tell you something?" Charlotte smiled warmly. "Of course." Lily took a deep breath before speaking. "When we are together, it does not feel like anybody is replacing Mommy. It feels like her kindness found another person to live inside." Neither Ethan nor Charlotte answered immediately. They simply sat together beneath the gentle afternoon sun, listening to the breeze move through the maple leaves while the newly planted sunflower seeds rested quietly beneath the soil, unseen for now, yet already beginning the slow journey toward the light. Just as three hearts had quietly begun growing into a family that honored the past without being afraid of the future. Winter arrived quietly, covering the neighborhood with a light blanket of snow that made even ordinary mornings feel a little more peaceful. Life settled into a gentle rhythm that none of them had planned, yet all of them quietly cherished. On Saturday mornings, Ethan still woke before sunrise to make blueberry pancakes while Lily carefully arranged 3 plates instead of 2 without anyone reminding her. Charlotte often arrived carrying fresh fruit or a new library book, never expensive gifts, because she had learned that the greatest moments in their home were always the simplest ones. She helped wash dishes after breakfast, laughed while Lily explained impossible science experiments, and joined Ethan in caring for the small backyard where the sunflower seeds planted weeks earlier now rested beneath the winter soil, waiting patiently for spring. Nothing about their lives became extravagant. The old silver sedan still started with a familiar rattle every morning. The wooden porch still creaked beneath every step. The mailbox still leaned slightly toward the sidewalk after every heavy rain. Yet the house somehow felt brighter because loneliness no longer occupied every quiet corner. A few days before Christmas, Lily asked if they could decorate the evergreen tree Emily had planted beside the front porch years earlier. As the afternoon sky slowly turned golden, the 3 of them carefully wrapped warm white lights around the branches while gentle holiday music drifted through the open front door. Ethan watched Charlotte hang a simple glass ornament near the center of the tree before stepping back with a thoughtful smile. "She would have loved this," Charlotte whispered. Ethan nodded softly. Emily always believed hope grows slowly, just like evergreen trees. Lily suddenly disappeared inside the house and returned holding a small handmade ornament shaped like a bright yellow sunflower. She carefully placed it into Charlotte's hands. "This one belongs to you," she said with complete certainty. Charlotte looked surprised. "Are you sure?" Lily smiled warmly. "Mommy always said family is not only the people you are born with. Sometimes it is the people who keep choosing to stay." Charlotte's eyes filled gently with grateful tears as she hung the sunflower beside the brightest light on the tree. Several evenings later, Bennett Financial hosted its annual holiday gathering. Employees filled the beautifully decorated ballroom with cheerful conversation while soft piano music played in the background. Near the end of the evening, Charlotte stepped onto the small stage holding nothing except a folded piece of paper. The room gradually became silent. "People often ask me what the greatest achievement of my career has been," she began calmly. "They expect me to mention profits or buildings. They are always mistaken." Her eyes found Ethan and Lily standing together near the back of the room. Many years ago, 2 ordinary people showed kindness to a frightened stranger without asking for anything in return. "Everything meaningful I have built began with the values they quietly lived every single day." No one applauded immediately. Every employee simply listened. Charlotte stepped down from the stage and walked toward Ethan with peaceful confidence. Ethan smiled as he remembered the careless joke that had unexpectedly opened the door to this extraordinary journey. He gently reached for Charlotte's hand. "The first time I asked you a question," he said softly, "I was only trying to make everyone laugh." Charlotte smiled through grateful eyes. "I know." Ethan took one steady breath before continuing. "This time I am asking with complete sincerity. Would you continue walking through ordinary life with Lily and me, one quiet day after another?" Charlotte answered without speaking. She simply placed her hand in his while Lily wrapped her arms around both of them beneath the glow of the Christmas lights. In that peaceful embrace, they all understood the truth Emily had lived long before any of them recognized its power. That kindness given without expecting reward never disappears, because sooner or later it always returns, carrying hope, healing, and the quiet dignity of a family that chooses one another every single day.